Hello and welcome to our special series ahead of the Union budget. 10 things the Finance Minister must do. We're looking at all those important points and discussing it right here. Today, we are taking the first 5. Let's look at the 10 things the Finance Minister must do. First, of course, manufacturing. With the government's Make in India focus, it has to give it priority so that large companies come, invest in India, and our manufacturing picks up once again. Infrastructure investment, another challenge. They have added new projects. So how this will come about, the policy will be watched more closely. More capital formation, they need to revive investment and channel it into the manufacturing activities once again. Changes in corporate tax, remove retro tax. This is one of the big expectations as far as policy signals to foreign investors are concerned. So it will be looked at very closely. The fifth important point, personal tax rejig. Rework tax slabs and hike exemption limits. What this will do is leave more money in the hands of people. Sixth point, fiscal deficit versus food security. Can the government contain public spending without cutbacks in food security? That is one of the challenges that the Finance Minister faces. Policy reforms will have to be done. Convert ordinances into acts, and they have this budget session to do it in. GST implementation, another challenge. The draft legislation and resolution of contentious issues have to be done if they are to meet the 2016 deadline. And spending on Swachh Bharat goals, how will they do it? Will they be tax swaps as part of CSR for corporates? That is one decision which is expected this budget. Also, startups, extremely important. How do you do that? Single window clearance, reduce paperwork is some of the demands that they are looking at. So we're going to take up the 5 topmost things that the Finance Minister must do. And joining me here in our studios, Dr. Arvind Viramani. He is former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Also, Nabeen Balodia, Partner Tax at KPMG. He'll be taking questions on tax. And Sumant Sinha, CEO, ReNew Power Ventures. As far as industry is concerned, it is very important what they are expecting. My first question to you, Mr. Sinha, what are the policy directions that industry is looking at this budget as far as manufacturing is concerned, if they indeed have to kickstart manufacturing?
I think, first of all, the macroeconomic situation of the country has to be right, which means a tighter fiscal deficit, which means a lower subsidy situation, which then creates a favorable environment for the RBI to reduce rates. Because unless the cost of capital in India goes down, every project has to deliver very high returns to even make it viable, which therefore actually puts a lot of projects out of the viability list. So therefore, reducing cost of capital is a very important factor for which the Finance Minister has to get the macroeconomics right. That is one. The second thing, and how much of this can be done through the budget, I am not exactly sure, but certainly the ease of doing business in India is very poor right now. As we all know, our ranking is like 150 or something. The Prime Minister set a target of going down to 50 out of 180 countries, which means a substantial change in how we tax, in how we monitor, in how we actually give approvals from the government and so on. So that is something that the Finance Minister has to, at some level, at least make some statements about.
Dr. Viramani, is it a challenge for the government? Because, as far as manufacturing is concerned, if they are to kickstart it, as Sumant Sinha put it, the macroeconomic picture has to be right.
So there are two basic issues here. One is the fiscal deficit targets which were outlined by the Finance Minister, and the second is how to give a push to expenditure, particularly investment expenditure. I think the trick will lie in what is not often talked about, which is the revenue deficit. What the revenue deficit does is it has very important consequences. First, it means that the government is reducing its dis savings, which results in overall greater national savings and also less indebtedness outside. Secondly, what it does is it creates the fiscal space. That is, you can still meet your fiscal targets, but spend more on investment, because that is not part of the revenue deficit, it's part of the fiscal deficit. So I would particularly be watching what happens on the revenue deficit, because I think they should focus on reducing it and therefore creating the space for more investment and an investment stimulus, which will then benefit manufacturing also.
Right. I mean, it's a circle, isn't it? Now, a target 4.1 of the GDP as far as fiscal deficit is concerned, that is largely expected to be met. That is what reports are saying till now. But revenues, as you said, the revenues will be challenging because manufacturing has been low in the country.
That's absolutely right, because both excise duties and customs duties, because of fall in oil prices, etc., means all the duties and excise collections from manufacturing is lower. So that is the challenge. Now, part of it, as you recall, is the the way we calculate the fiscal deficit. It includes disinvestment. So the disinvestment push which has happened and will continue probably till the budget will partly take care of that problem. It will offset those tax reductions.
Right. Let's look at infrastructure investment now. How easy is it going to be for the government to bring in money? And I'll get in Sumant Sinha on that. Where will the money come from? It's all right to talk about, clean Ganga. It's all right to talk about smart cities, but where will the money going to come from? Because corporates largely today, they don't have capital right now. They're struggling.
No, I think those are terrific questions, Karma, because ultimately the reality is that, the private sector has to invest. The private sector, as you said, is in a bad situation right now. But having said that, a lot of corporates do have money to invest, but they will not put that money to work unless and until, as I said earlier, we get that demand visibility. So, for example, in renewable energy, that's my sector, the government has announced a very ambitious target. Now, that target has to be followed through with a number of things, either in terms of Electricity Act amendments, which the government is trying to do, or follow up at the state level, because power is a concurrent subject. So unless they get states on board and create an overall conducive environment for states to buy more power, the target will just remain a target. And so therefore, behind everything that the government has articulated right now, they have to now, over the next 1 year, do very strong, very diligent follow-up work to make those targets more tangible. And I think it's only once that happens that you'll really start seeing corporates begin to invest. The third point that you raised is about money coming from overseas. The reality is foreign investors will not invest money in India again until and unless they see this long-term visibility and they see the government is following through on a lot of the promises that it is making right now. So it will take at least another 1 year, I think, before you start seeing some of these green shoots converting themselves into reality. And therefore the government cannot take its foot off the pedal right now. They have to follow through. Step 1 was coming out of targets, which they've done. Step 2 now needs to be to follow through with a lot of the concrete and hard steps at the sectoral level. I think it's only then that you'll start seeing capital coming in.
Dr. Bidmani, let's look at the figure. 60 lakh crore rupees is needed for infrastructure projects. Where will this money come from? Interesting question. Government keeps talking about public-private partnership, but the NPAs are increasing when we look at money from private industries.
Right. So part of the problem, if we look at the historical record, part of the problem was that the policy and regulatory environment was not right, and then the government felt impelled to kind of force directly or indirectly the public sector to lend to infrastructure activities which were not viable because of the policy environment. So the key looking forward into the future is two things. One is get the policy and regulatory environment right, and second is take care of the old NPAs and the legacy problems of the infrastructure, because as long as those problems exist, those banks are not going to lend, those companies cannot proceed forward. So those are, you're right, these are the two things to watch.
I mean, when you talk to investors from abroad, which you do interact with on a frequent basis, what are you looking at? Because if long-term capital has to come from abroad, they will be looking at returns. Right. Can the government guarantee returns or not? At this point, in how many years? We don't know.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points that investors would typically look at when they are coming to India or investing in India. And these are opportunity, and second one is certainty. So opportunity from an Indian perspective, I think it's a given fact, everyone knows about it, but I think certainty is something which is very, very important. In the last few years, when you see about the return on investment, I think there have been concerns with respect to land acquisition, there have been concerns with respect to environmental clearances, and projects have actually gone beyond the initially indicated timeline, and that's exactly what is creating a lot of concern for the private investors. They definitely want that the project should be completed within the time frame, and that's what their intention would be, and that's where they can actually get their money, the return on investment that is expected.
Right. Mr. Sinha, we've been going around the country, speaking to manufacturers who spend most of their time on the shop floor, capital goods is concerned, they are saying, you know, the sentiment is excellent, but they don't see demand picking up anytime soon.
I think certainly people are interested. People see the benefit of the large market in India. People do want to play in this market. But having said that, it will take a little bit of extra persuasion on the part of the government to actually make these investments happen. And that extra persuasion really is in the form of legislative action, sector by sector reform, as I said earlier, policy action, and improving the ease of doing business. I mean, I can't tell you, for example, land acquisition in India, or even getting a project done at the ground level. It's extremely hard still because, you know, a lot of people can come in and stop your project from going ahead. And, you know, those kind of things you can keep running from the courts to the police, but it's very hard to really get help. And so therefore, we have to find some way of improving this overall local environment such that we can actually make investments happen.
So, Doctor, can there be greater, therefore, can there be greater do you see greater investment coming from the government? Do they have the money or the wherewithal to do this?
Well, it's a combination. The government, as I said, can, so one part is the government, because they are what we call public goods, which really the government has to put out. You know, there are certain things which have a social return but don't have a private return, and government has to be there. So the question is how to do more investment without breaking the fiscal deficit targets, and the only way is to cut down on what we call current expenditures, subsidies, etc., which we are the wasteful expenditures as we call them. The second part is the private sector. As I was trying to suggest is, you know, the private sector cannot take on policy risk. That is, if policies change arbitrarily, if regulations are not clear, as was just mentioned by him, and certain, those are things government can improve. As far as market risk is concerned, of course, they have to take the market risk because that's the whole point. That's why the private sector is there. So market activities, they have to take a risk and then get the return. But the first part of it is the government's responsibility.
When it comes to targeting of subsidies, Naveen, one thing that is being talked about right now is some people could lose that cooking gas subsidy in the right direction. But and the other thing is that this government does have the mandate. So are you expecting strong measures like this one?
Yeah, I think we have given these subsidies since independence, so it would take a bit of a time for people to actually accept that. But probably in the interest of the organization, of the country, it is important that we should accept, or people should accept, these subsidy cuts coming in the near future. And we would expect some changes coming in very soon.
So the way, you know, the way I look at it is there's a gap between what the government spends and what gets to the person for whom it's intended. And as we all know, part of that is corruption, part of that is inefficiency. So really the government has to target these two things so that we spend less, but the final recipient doesn't get less. He could actually end up getting more directly into his pocket. And that's the key. And as we have most have agreed, the direct cash transfer or the direct benefit transfer is really the only way to go in our kind of circumstances. So again, people will be watching what further measures or what direction is given in the budget.
Right. With that, go into a short break. But as far as taxes are concerned, indirect, direct, the ones that impact you and me, what will the finance minister need to do? We'll discuss that when we return. Welcome back. You're watching a special show ahead of the union budget. 10 things the finance minister must do. Let's now look at the other important thing. As far as tax incentives are concerned, will we see tax incentives this time? Naveen, especially since it's Make in India, a lot of people are saying that, okay, maybe for Make in India, there will be certain cutbacks, there will be certain incentives that will be given to manufacturers to spur growth.
Couple of things that are being expected. One of them is cutting down on the minimum alternate tax. So I think that's something which is very, very important. Currently, it is at the rate of 18.5%, you know, aggregating with the surcharge and education cess becomes about 20%, which definitely is hurting the industry substantially. And the other thing is that if we want to make India as a manufacturing hub, there is some degree of incentive which is required for R&D, for manufacturing. And the last thing that I would actually expect is correcting the inverted duty structure for import of goods. Some of the raw materials, when they are imported, the duty is charged at a higher rate, whereas the finished products, when they are imported, the duty is at a lower rate. So I think that's something which needs to be rectified this budget as well.
Right. As far as reforms in the indirect taxes are concerned, perhaps we'll have to wait for the GST to be rolled out completely. Deadline is next year. But they can do a lot as far as sending out that message, isn't it, if they are to somehow roll back the retrospective tax. That will give out a strong message out, because that's really dampened sentiment for the last few years.
Yeah. There's a little bit of problem here, because in the interim or the last budget, the finance minister actually made reasonably clear that there is not much he can do about the past. And the reason is there are roughly 3 or 4, as I understand, he would know more, 5 cases which are pending because of this in various stages. And I think the message he gave last time was that he can't do much because he doesn't want to interfere in those cases. For example, the Vodafone case is before arbitration. So my expectation would be that they will allow the arbitration to proceed and then accept whatever the arbitrator says, rather than saying that we've changed the law and that retrospective doesn't apply to Vodafone, let's say. I think that may be a little difficult.
Mr. Sinha, one word from you. Of course, corporates would love for the taxes to come down.
Well, obviously all of us would like tax rates to go down, because whether it's MAT or whether it's the corporate tax rate, obviously all of us would like, depending on our different scenarios, for those rates to come down. But the government is in a very difficult position, because they're trying to achieve 4.1% fiscal deficit this year, 3.6 next year. I don't know how much of that can come only by slashing expenditure. It appears to me that they have to keep tax levels somewhat buoyant as well. Now, somebody can make the argument that, look, if you reduce corporate tax rates or MAT, then you'll have more investments, and those investments will lead to its own tax collections over a period of time. But, that will take some 2-3 years to happen, whereas the government needs the collections right now. And so, therefore, the government is in a difficult position. I don't sympathize, I sympathize with them in this particular matter. But I think they have to choose 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sectors and then try to give those sectors some incentive. And, they should look at sectors which perhaps can have investments happening fairly rapidly. So I think that's really what they need to do. For example, they did that in the IT sector, many years ago, when they gave free, made it free from taxation. And that is really what got the sector going, among other things, of course. So I think they have to do something similar.
Let's look at the final point today, personal tax rejig. We are looking at reworking of tax slabs and hike exemption limits. Now, that message has come more than often, isn't it, from the finance minister's office, that he'd like to see more money in the hands of the people. Very important, because we've seen savings fall from about 30% of the gross national disposable income if you look at the year 2013-2014.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is an immediate requirement to actually rejig the exemption limits that we have, because currently we are talking about only 2.5 lakh rupees, which is exempt for an individual. Definitely, this needs to be brought up, because if you just compare it with the global standards, it's actually pretty low. Even if you look at some of the other expenditures or deductions that are there, like say for example medical reimbursement, which came in sometimes in 1998 and which stands at 15,000 rupees, which is pretty low compared to the medical cost that we talk about today. So definitely there is a need to provide that incentive to the individuals, because at the end of the day, if there is an incentive there would be more money in their hands, which would actually impact, have the saving as well as the purchasing power of the individual.
Right, it's part of our Axe the Tax campaign, where we've asked him to hike medical limit, because it is strange. One visit to the doctor and you are set back by how much? About 1,500 rupees, and that's the money you get. There's a serious rethink has to be done.
There are 2 or 3 exemptions which in my view are clearly justified. One is medical. So yeah, one would expect that inflation adjustment, you quite rightly, the prices have gone up so much that would be accepted by most. But there is a group of economists who say that you should widen the tax net and not keep raising the lower limit. My guess is he'll go the first route and not the second one, which is he will probably increase the exemptions on these critical things like medicine, medical insurance, etc.
We certainly hope the finance minister is listening. Thank you so much for joining us on this show. With that, we come to the end of this show, but our focus on the union budget remains here on CNN-IBN. Thanks for watching.